In this tutorial, we're going to make a version of a chatbot. So we're going to have the computer prompt us with questions, and we will provide answers. It will analyze those answers and ask follow-up questions after providing a response to our answer. So it's going to be a very, very basic kind of chatbot that allows us to learn about using arrays in JavaScript, a little bit of processing text on strings, and some different array methods. So it allows us to cover a couple basic important concepts in JavaScript while building a little bit of a chatbot. Now, in no way is this going to be like OpenAI's ChatGPT, which uses a large language model and significantly deeper processing, which is super trendy right now. Our chatbot is going to be a much simpler version. So I have my file up. I already launched it with live server so that I can see that. I'm going to just pull up my code here. I'm not sure why I got that random error message. There's no JavaScript running yet on my page, so that was bizarre. I think it's just tied to the live server extension or some other extension coming out of Visual Studio Code. But I have my document here. It isn't doing anything. And in the main document, we have a couple elements. And the first thing that we need to do is we need to grab control of those elements. So we have some CSS in there, different ways of centering or styling our objects. So if you want to learn more about the centering, go into CSS Tricks, the complete centering guide, and we have these commented out methods of ways to do it. But that's a topic for a different day. What we care about right now is starting to write some JavaScript. So with that, going to start grabbing the elements that I'm going to need. So we have our different elements on here. We have a paragraph that has an ID of computer, we have an input, ID of human, and we have our button. So these are the three things that we need to be able to access. So we'll just go const computer equals document dot query selector, and then with that, we'll grab computer. Now I could just grab the paragraph because it is the only one on the page, but if you design a more complex page, put other things into it, you're going to need to be a little bit more specific about it. Now I'll grab my human, again, document, query selector, and this time it'll be hashtag human. Now, finally, we have our button. Our button has an ID on it, so I could access it in the same manner. And we can use document. And we're going to just, for learning purposes, so we have options of get elements by class name, by tag name, and if we notice, it's get elements. It's a plural option, get elements by tag name. We also have, so we can do it by class, we can get things by ID, but we can also get things by tag name. When we get it by tag name, we specify the kind of element that I'm getting. So the tag is button. And then what we're going to use is square brackets, and the button, in this case I use a 0, because what happens when we choose get elements by tag name, it actually is returning an array. And arrays are really kind of the whole point and purpose of this particular project, so I thought it would be kind of fun to use get elements by tag name, again plural on the elements. And it returns an array. So arrays inside most programming languages use square brackets to denote that it's an array. And we can reference items in the array by their position, where they sit within that array. And in this case, we only have one item in our array, because we only have one button, and we're asking for that first one. So if our page had 6 buttons on it, and we wanted to access the last one, the 6th button, we would put a number 5 here, because computers like to start counting from 0. So the first item is at position 0, the last item would be at position 5 if we had 6 elements that were in our array. But in this case, we only have one, and we want to get the very first one, that first button, so we use a 0. So if I look at the reference page on W3 Schools for arrays, we'll see that we can construct an array using square brackets, and then we put items in that array. So an array is really just a list of items. And with that list of items, we can access that particular item by referencing its position. In this case, this would be 0, 1, 2. We have 3 items in this array, so our array has a length of 3, and their items are at 0, 1, and 2. So that's how we can access them. So if we jump into try it ourselves here, so if we say I wanted to access the second item in the array, so it's at position 1, if we run this, we'll see that it spits out Volvo as part of it. Now if I wanted to know how many items are in the array, we use the property length. And now we can see there are 3 items in this array. So this is the kind of core concept that we're going to need as we start using our array inside our project in a little bit. But for now, we haven't got that far. First, we now have access to our items. What I want to next do is set the focus of our item so that the human is focused. So right now, if we look at the page, here's the page. But what I want is when the page loads, I want our cursor to be in where the human is going to type the response so that it is ready to happen. So let's just save this. And now I go here and we can see how it's automatically received the focus. The cursor is now flashing in there ready to type, so I don't have to click there. So that's a nice item that we can add to our project while we're working on it. So we have some other variables that we're going to need later as we start building up the logic in our project. But what we want to do next is to add in some event listeners. Now, I want, when I click on the button, I want it to then do something. So we'll have button add event listener, and we always put the event we're working with inside of quotation marks. And then I'll reference the function that it's going to call, and we always say that the bubbling on this will be false. So now let's set up, actually let's just put a return here. White space is always useful when we're working. Now we'll set up our functions here. And the function I want to call is simply play game. Now, we have a function calling another function. That's pretty normal. And do I need to have the click handler, or could I just immediately, just when I click on that, call play game? Probably, but maybe there is some additional logic that I want to have take place there. So, you know, this makes sense to separate that out. So now I'm going to set up my function play game, and now within this function I just want to make something happen with that, and what we can do is we're going to set up and print out our computer message here. So what we want to do inside of play game, we want to set the computer's text content to a message. And in this case, I'm just going to hard code something in here. Later on, we're going to set a variable, and because we'll be setting the computer's message in a little more, it's going to be a little bit more complicated to set it, so we need to store it in a variable. But for right now, we'll say you clicked the button. Now let's save this and click the button, and we can see how the computer's text changed. So it gave me a response, and the way that this chatbot's going to work best is we have a response and we follow that by a question. So let's just save that now. Now we don't see anything else happening yet because we don't have anything else happening. So we've proven that our button works. It's not really doing anything impressive yet. So we want to add a little bit more functionality into our document here so that we can work with it. So what I'm going to do is we need some other variables that we are going to store as part of our game here. So let me set these up. And what I want to do is I want to be able to store whatever the person has input into our project. So we'll have the message that the human typed in, and with that we'll just store that currently in an empty string, so we know that this is going to be a string. We will be updating things here a little bit inside play game in a moment. And then what I also want to do is go let the computer's message equal to an empty string as well. So that now gets me started with adding some things. And finally, what I want to do is add in some basic responses so that the computer's going to ask us things, and it's going to start giving me some responses. This is where we start to set some of the personality. And I'm going to create an array called generic responses. Now, these are going to be statements, text, small sentences. So to do this, it will be difficult to just continue fitting them all in one line. So I'm going to separate them out onto multiple lines. So arrays are just elements that are separated by a comma. So I'm going to just put in some generic responses here and say I'm going to start out and just say good for you. So what we're doing here is just kind of setting the tone or personality of our chatbot. And it's up to you to determine, is this going to be a friendly chatbot, an unhappy chatbot? Is it, what is it? So I have 4 responses here. You could add as many generic things as you want. And we're going to then choose off of this list based on what a random value initially. So we're just going to compute out a random value as part of this. And to do that kind of random value, we need to come up with a function for doing this. And this is where we have to use some of these array properties. So we're going to build this function in a couple of different ways. We'll start out basic and then we'll start expanding upon it. So it's not something that we're going to just be done on it. So remembering that our array of responses is just like that array of cars we saw on W3 schools. So what I want to do is I want to just choose randomly one of those items. So what we can do is we can generate a random number and then use that random number to set the computer message equal to that item. Now the random number should be based on the length of the array, but then generate position numbers. So we can use a couple of different math operations in JavaScript to do this. So it's not something, it's not scary hard math or anything like that. We're going to use rounding down, and we use the floor method for that, and then we'll use a random number. So the code that we're going to type in here is we're going to just create a variable here, and we can just create this variable inside this function because we don't, it doesn't need to exist anywhere outside of this function, so we don't need to make it a variable that exists up in our primary variables that we're working on. So this is just something we need while we're calculating in the function. Technically we don't need it, we could put it in, but our line of code would get really long when we do that, and it would be pretty hard to read at that point. So we're going to just say our new response is going to be equal to, and this time I will say, so if we want to round a number down, we use the math.floor method. And then the number we want to round down is we want to take and generate a random number based on how many items are in our array. So if we use the math.random method, what that does is that returns a random number from 0 up to but not including 1. So 0 to 0.99999, about 16 decimal places worth of value. So it's a pseudo-random, but for all intents and purposes, it's random enough for what we're doing. So we get this random number. And then if we multiply that random number, I'll just put a space here to make it easier to read, by our generic response's length. So remember that the length of an array is how many items are in that array. So we'll just do a simple version. If this random number turned 0, 0 times the length of the array would still be 0, rounds down to 0. So our new response number would be 0. But let's say the random number was 0.99999 times, in this case our array is 4. So then our result would be 0.99999 times 4, so it'd be kind of 3.99999 like that, rounds down to 3. Because 3.1, 3.5, 3.9, it all rounds down to 3. Because if we're only rounding down, and if I have 4 items in my array, the final item would be 3. If it turned out a value of 0.5, so 0.5 times 4 would give me a value of 2. 2 rounds down, well, it still stays at 2. So then I would get the third item in the array. So looking at the values here, we get different numbers that will all round down to give me the whole numbers I need of 0, 1, 2, 3. So that's the math that we're working with here. So we create a random number, multiply it by how long our array is, its length, the item or number of items in the array, and then we round down. That gives us our numbers that we need, and now we can just simply say our computer message is going to be equal to generic responses, and then we will get our response out of that. So I used, again, the square brackets to designate generic responses as an array. Square brackets allows me to access something by its position. The position is this number we generated, in our case 0, 1, 2, 3. If you have more items in your generic responses, then your length is longer and you would have more potential numbers that you can work with. So now I'm going to change this under this and just say computer message. So now the computer's text content will become that computer message. So every time I press that button, it's going to do that. So let's just save this. Now if we go over here, I can type whatever I want in. Don't even have to type anything, and we can see we got nothing. And we got nothing because we changed this to computer message, but I forgot to call generic response calculation first. So first I have to call generic response calculation. Then we can update with that computer message. So now let's save that. Now we can see how each time I hit here. Now the error message that I'm getting here is tied in with the live server doing some wonkiness here. So it's not actually, because it says that we have an error on line 1. And that would be a JavaScript error on line 1. But if I look up at line 1, there's no JavaScript on line 1. So sometimes when we're looking here, if it's working, we don't need to worry too much about it. And we can see if I keep pressing the button periodically, notice how I press and it repeats. I click multiple times and nothing happens because it's giving me that same answer multiple times in a row. So that's a problem there. What I'm going to do, just so that we can see that a little bit easier, I'm going to add to it. So every time it's just going to add to our generic response here. So we'll just see them all piling up over and over and over. So let's just save that. So we can see you should get a life twice. Good for you, good for you, good. So we can see how we get some repeating in there. So that's a problem. We don't want that. Well, we also don't want to use the plus equals there, but that just allowed us to add and keep adding what we're doing. And I also realized under you should get a life, I forgot to put a period at the end. Just makes it look a little bit better. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at an additional array method. Going back into our schools here. So our W3 schools, we have an array method where I can say cars.push now we can see it says, hey look, there's 4 there, and if we just print out all the cars, let's see that I now added VW to the list. Oh, it should be capital just so it looks a little better. So we've added an additional vehicle to our list. So push is a method we can add things. So we can make our arrays grow and get bigger. But we can also remove elements from our arrays. So it's similar to our method of accessing things. So if I use the method of splice, and when we use splice, what we're able to do is we're able to remove something from this. But we say at what array position we want to remove something. So if I want to remove sob from this, I would go, that's at position 0, and I want to remove one element. Now, if I run this, we'll see that sob is gone from that list. But instead, if I wanted to remove the BMW, so sob is 0, Volvo is 1, the position of BMW is 2. So if I say 2, comma 1, that's going to remove the second element from our array. So we're the third element, but it's in position number 2, 0, 1, 2. So if we run this, the BMW is gone. So push allows us to add things to an array. Splice allows us to remove a specific element based on its position. And that's going to be important. So now going back here, what we're going to do is we're going to put a little bit of conditional logic. So we'll use an if statement. So we'll say if my generic responses length is greater than 0, meaning there is something in that array, we're going to do what we were doing before. So we'll set our new response. Our computer message will be updated on that. And then finally, what we need to do is we need to take our generic responses and we will use that splice method. So I want to remove the item at the position that we figured out with new response. So we'll say new response, and we want to remove one item from our array. So new response, comma 1. That gets rid of it. So now we can save this. And so now we can see you should leave now. I like you, good for you, you should get a life. And it doesn't do anything else because there's nothing left in our array. So let's just add a little else here. Not ESLA, but ELSE. And now in this else, what I'm going to do is go computer message. We'll set that equal to I am done. Save this. Now we can hit here. I like you, good for you, you should leave now, you should get a life, I am done. So it ends it. That's a good step right there. So now it's been ended. And just for fun, we're going to add an additional method here where we're going to call a function, but we don't want to call it immediately. We want to give the human a moment to read what the computer has said, because then we're going to actually make our page go to a new location. So to do that, we can just use the simple method of set timeout, and then I'm going to call a function here. I haven't made it yet, but I'm going to make it in just a moment. And then we specify how many milliseconds, so thousandths of a second. So 1,000 milliseconds is 1 second, so I'm doing 2,000. So it will hang for 2 seconds, and then it will call the function end game. Well, if we have a function, now we have to define it. So function end game. And now this function, what we can do is use our location dot assign, And what that allows us to do is to specify a URL that we want to go visit. So in this case, the URL I want to go to is, I'll just send it to OpenAI because that seems kind of appropriate here. We'll send it to its big brother. Now we save this. So 1, 2, 3, 4. And now I am done. We wait 2 seconds and we can see how it went to the OpenAI website. Now let's go back. We're not on that site anymore. So with this, we have a chatbot that's not, it's only giving statements here. Ideally, it should have a response and then ask another question, prompting you to type something in, and then it can give, another thing. Good for you. Did you have a nice day? Because this way, it prompts people to type into the response. Now, these are all questions that we don't, really care what the answer is going to be because it's all being provided randomly. So now, I like you. We'll have something a little bit more affirming here. And then you should leave now. Maybe the internet is not for you. No, that's what I want to ask a question though. So none of the questions are relevant, and we don't actually care what the answers are going to be, but now if I go in here and type yes, and click the button. All right, so I typed a response, and now I can see that my response is still there. So it'd be nice every time I type a response, it goes away as the computer gives me a response. So we're going to make that part of play game, and what we can do under play game is just say our human is the input field, and we'll set its value equal to an empty string. So that will now make it go away when I click on it. So let's just save that. I am good. Click the button, and now we can see, and I don't want to go away, so we'll bring it back. All right. So this is good, but what I don't like is typing and then having to take my hand off the keyboard and click the mouse. So what we're going to do is we're just going to add in another little helper function that is going to listen for keyboard events. Now, keyboard events aren't tied to elements, they're tied to the window. So we tell our window to add event listener, and the key event we want is key down, all lowercase. And then we'll do our key down handler, and now we have to make that function. So we have our click handler, which calls play game, and then my key down handler is going to listen for it. So what we have to do is we have to specify the event, and this is a function parameter. So sometimes we use the letter E, other times you may see it EVT or event spelled out in its entirety. I like to just use E so it's short. Whoop, don't need that extra parenthesis, and then throw in my curly braces. Because what we are going to do is we're going to look at what is the code associated with the key that has been pressed. So every character on your keyboard has key code associated with it, an ASCII keyboard, ASCII key code number. So we can say if the event that happened, which was the key down, if that event's key code, and that is, the C is capitalized in key code, and if that number happens to be 13, which is the number, the ASCII character code or key code for the return or enter key on my keyboard. So if that is the case, then I want to say play game. So this is part of why I like having it play game separated into its own function, because then I can click on the button or I can press the return or enter key to achieve. So if you want to know all of the key codes, you can do a simple search for ASCII key code list or something along that line, and we can now find the different characters. So we have control characters, so we can see carriage return 13, so that gives it to us. Space is 32, shift is 16. The arrow keys are 37, 38, 39, and 40, left, up, right, down. So each key on the keyboard has a specific key code associated with it. So you can program it. So if you want to build a little keyboard kind of game where you would use WASD, you would have to go find the character codes. So you could go find our character codes for WASD. So we can see we have 97 for A, 100 for D. So yeah, you can go figure out the math on these looking at your chart, put these in, and make it happen. Another thing you can do is you could just have a simple function that on your key down, every time you press a key, that it spits the key code into the console so that you can figure out what your key codes are as you are working. So if I type console.log and then just put some text, key code plus e dot key code. So now let's save this. Now if I go over here, A, 65, S, D, W, arrow keys, and then we can see as I type different keys I get letters. If I hit return 13, and now it gave me a response there. So we can see that we have these key codes, but it is a lot nicer. So it says, I'll say no, hit return. No, hit return. Yes, hit return. No, hit return. And now it's done. Wait for it to time out, go back. All right. So we've made some significant progress on this. We've made it a little bit nicer. We have some basic responses going on, but what we now need to do in the next stage, the next phase of our development, is to start analyzing the input that's been provided by the human so that we can ask more specific questions so that our chatbot appears to be intelligent.